All right, and welcome to Lesson 4 of our Bootstrap course on native SDK. We have made some real progress at this point. By now, we can create charts, we can visualize actual data, not just examples, but actual data, and we can do that even when the data requires like a little bit of nuance to get into the chart properly, even if it can't just be hard-coded, for example. So that's pretty big. That's definitely the biggest common denominator between all the different use cases you're going to have in native SDK. And given that, there's a lot of different places you could go from here. A lot of different use cases will require slightly different things, so there's a lot to explore. But there is still one element that is very common across a very wide range of use cases. Not every use case, it's not like data, which applies pretty much everywhere, but this does apply in a lot of cases, and that is events. So, what are events exactly? This is a bit like HTML, actually. So if you know HTML, you know you can write your HTML document, you can get all that set up exactly the way you want in whatever page you have, you can even add CSS and get it styled exactly like you want. But at some point, you run into the issue of, hey, I have this HTML page, and I can't do anything with it. It might look nice, but it's just a static web page. How do I interact with it? How can I make it do interesting things? And if you know HTML, that's where you start adding in events. Like you start adding in the OnClick event, make things happen when you click on things. And from there, you can start linking in JavaScript that implements, okay, when the user clicks on this, then I want this specific thing to happen, and I can code it to do whatever you want. It can do anything at all. But events are the critical bridge between the HTML world and the custom JavaScript code world, which does all the different things you want. And in ZoomCharts, the same basic concept applies. You have ZoomCharts, you set them up with data and everything else and get them exactly like you want. And then at some point, ZoomCharts has these nice default interactions which can do a lot of things, but at some point, you're in a lot of cases going to run into things where you just want something a little bit more specific, a little bit more customized, things that apply to your case specifically and aren't just generic chart interaction. And that's when events come in. Just like with HTML, you can add in these events, and then that's the critical bridge between what ZoomCharts is doing in that world and the custom code which you use and can do whatever you want when various things are occurring in ZoomCharts. And that's really the core idea. So today, we're going to try and give a pragmatic summary overview of events. And I'm going to do that by giving you a complete, specific example of how you can set up events to do one particular meaningful thing. And then from there, I'll branch out a bit. And I'll discuss a few of the details of some of the other things you can do with events, how things would vary in the different use cases, and I'll even discuss a little bit of details in some specific cases where events would have a few more interesting nuances than in just the example I showed. And that's the big idea today. And again, I want to emphasize, this is a summary overview. So that means I'm not going to be going through an exhaustive list of all the possible ways you can set up events and all the different possible things you can possibly do with them, and so forth and so on. So we're just going to be going through a few of the most critical highlights today to try and get you up to speed as quickly as possible. And if you're interested in some of the more nuanced details, a lot of those can be found in the documentation. That said, in the next lesson, we're going to be tying together all we've learned about events and data and making an implementation of cross-chart filtering. And that will give you a chance to see how a lot of the finer details work out anyways in the case where you're doing something a little bit more complicated and a little bit more nuanced than the examples we've been dealing with so far. Today, though, we're covering events, so let's just get straight to it. So, to show you how to set up events in a practical example, the first thing we need is a chart we can add events to, of course. And I'm going to go ahead and create a file for this. I'm not going to go in too much detail here because we've already discussed how that works in earlier videos, but I'm going to base this on the example we created earlier. I'm just going to create a file I'm going to call events. And in our events HTML file, which is by default the same as that, I'm actually just going to delete everything we have except for the first chart. And that is really the basis here. So if I move here, you see now we just have the first chart. And this is just going to be the baseline. So we're going to be using a net chart, for example, and I'll just show you a basic case of how to add events to that. I mentioned earlier how ZoomCharts events are a little bit analogous to HTML events. So just like in HTML, you can set up your HTML page however you want and then add, say, an OnClick event listener and then connect that to whatever JavaScript you want. You can do the same sort of thing in ZoomCharts. You can set up your data and the rest of your settings however you want, and then you can add an event listener like OnClick to make ZoomCharts respond with whatever JavaScript you want to click events. So for the first part of our example, I'm just going to show you how to do the equivalent of an OnClick event listener with ZoomCharts events. So the way this works, as you might have suspected, is it takes place in the settings. So right below data, we can add an event settings. So there you go. We have our events, and this is where you put all your listeners. So in HTML, you added an OnClick into the HTML tag. In ZoomCharts, you add OnClick with a capital C in ZoomCharts in the event settings, and then you specify your function. So the big thing it takes in is E and args. I'll explore those in a moment. But there, that's your event. So here I can just add something like console.log. I've clicked on something, and if I bring up the console and refresh the page, I should be able to click in the element, and look, we are now calling the custom function I've supplied whenever we click on something. And it doesn't occur when we click elsewhere on the page. It only occurs when we click within the chart itself. Of course, this is only, well, it's only somewhat useful when it's done like this because we probably want more information than just, I've clicked somewhere at all in the chart. Because, I mean, have I clicked on the slider, for example? In fact, this doesn't even technically count as part of the chart because this is a UI element that's in its own HTML container. So this really only tells me if I've clicked anywhere in the chart at all, including nodes and stuff, but not the toolbar. So that's not entirely what we're after. Ideally, we'd want something a little bit more specific because, I mean, in most cases, you'll want that sort of information so you can respond, oh, these are clicks on a node, do this. As it clicks in empty space, do that, and so forth, so on. So this is where the parameters to the OnClick function start coming into play. So you have the E parameter, this is the event object itself, but the thing you're usually interested in is the args object. And this is where ZoomCharts tells you all the information like, oh, you've clicked on this, you've done all this, and in fact, it's much easier if I just show you. So I'm going to add E and args into the console.log so that when I refresh the page and click somewhere, we can actually see an example of what these look like. So in the event object, you're going to see a lot of sort of technical information. And this can be useful. You can certainly use this. All the details of this, as usual, are in the documentation. But the one you're usually after is the args. And this tells you usually the specific things you're interested in, like, did I click on an item? Which this includes not just the node itself, but like, have I clicked on a specific part of the node? Like if I have an icon in the corner of the node, a node item, that's what they're called in ZoomCharts, it can tell me if I clicked on that rather than just the node itself. And same thing if I clicked on a link, it can tell me if I've hovered anything when I was clicking, even if I didn't necessarily click on that thing. It also tells me things like all the nodes, it tells me where the event came from. So is this like a robo-click? Was this caused by like someone called the ZoomCharts API to produce a click, for example? Is there a selection? That's, again, also very useful information. So this tells you basically the key details you want to know. You can get more information, of course, in the event object if you like, but args are usually what you're after. So let's take advantage of this. I'm going to start with a simple but very common case where we want something to happen when we click on a node. So the way you can do this is you can just check if args.clickNode. Because you notice ZoomCharts, it obviously is not present here, but if there is no click node, then it doesn't specify anything. So that field is actually not present unless there is a node we've clicked on. So that's really useful. That means you can just use an if statement, if args.clickNode, and that will do what you want with no further specialized fancy checks. It can be very straightforward. So I can change this to say now, I've clicked on a node. And now, if I minimize this and try again, so if I click an empty space, nothing happens. If I click on a link, nothing happens. If I click on the node, I've clicked on a node. So now we're starting to have the on-click behavior we're interested in, where we can distinguish elements within the chart, or more accurately, ZoomCharts does all the hard work of distinguishing the elements for you, and you just write a relatively straightforward event handler, and now you can make it do whatever you care for it to do. Now, obviously, what actually goes into this event handler is going to depend on your use case. If you have, say, extra information on your nodes that you want to be displayed to the user when they click on them, then you'd code that in. If you have like a specialized user interaction, like, oh, when the user clicks the nodes, then they reorganize in some interesting way around the nodes, that would go here. So this gets a little bit tricky to be too general here because this is very use case specific. But one thing that I think is worth calling special attention to is the ZoomCharts API, because ZoomCharts events and the ZoomCharts API go together like bread and butter. They're just excellent complements to each other, and usually you'll be wanting to use an API function here and there if you're writing an event handler. So one big one, for example, in NetChart, is you might want to add data on click. And you might have actually noticed this earlier. In the args, there's this other field for the chart itself. And you might be thinking, well, that's weird. Why would you have the chart? But it exists specifically for this purpose, so that you can call the ZoomCharts API within the event handler. I can do something like args.chart and then call one of the API functions, like, say, add data. And here I can just pass in a data object. I will keep this not too complicated here, so I'll just say, maybe want a node's, I don't know, I'll create a node ID in 6. So we're just adding a new node. And there we go. So if I click here, nothing happens. If I click on a node, the first node I click on, it adds a new node. Obviously, when I click on nodes again, it doesn't add more nodes because, well, node 6 already exists. So, I mean, technically it's trying to add it, but it notices, hey, this node already exists, so it just does nothing. But there you go. So those are some of the biggest ideas that come into play when you're dealing with events. And at this point, I just want to flesh this out just a little bit, not too in depth here, but just a little bit, just to give you a little bit of a better idea how you can take all these concepts and make it do something a little bit closer to a realistic use case. So let's say our use case is we want the user to be able to click on nodes, and when they click on a node, it adds a new node connected to that node. So if I click on node 4, I should get a new node that's connected to node 4, for example. How would that work? So obviously the basic way is something very much like this. But how do we get the connection? How do we make sure this node isn't like node 6 where it adds it and it's like, oh, I already added a connected node. I don't need to add another one. No, we actually do want new ones. So how does that work? So here's how we can apply these concepts just a little bit. Obviously this isn't that complicated, but again, that's the point. We don't want to go too in depth yet. So we can break this problem down into really two pieces. The first is what we might call the node 6 problem, which is how do we make it so clicking on a node always adds a new node and not just node 6? And the other is the connectivity problem. How can I make it so that when the new node is added, it's connected to whichever node I clicked on? So let's solve the node 6 problem first. And as you might imagine, the solution to this, not that complicated, just we need a new ID for every node. So I'm going to create a variable for this. This is a very simple solution. And just call it next node ID, which I'm going to say 0 at the beginning. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create the new node ID. I'll just say new node plus next node ID, and then after I've created the new node ID, I'll increment it. So again, very straightforward, and then I just use the new node ID. And this solves the new node problem, or the node 6 problem, because now, well, we're getting a new node ID every single time. So now I can click add nodes to my heart's content. So that solves one issue, but the other half of this problem is, well, okay, but how do I get the new node to be connected to whatever node I clicked on? And again, you can sort of break this down to two parts. The first is adding the link, because obviously if there's going to be a connection, it involves a link. So we're going to need links in our data as well. And we're going to, of course, need a link ID. So we actually have the node 6 problem again, so to speak. But we can just use the same sort of thing here. We can just create new link ID, call it new link, and there you go. Whoops. ID, new link ID. And this is going to go from something, and it's going to go to something. The only question is, what are these going to be? And this is the other part of the link connectivity problem. What exactly is the link connecting from, and what's it connecting to? Now, if you remember from the data format, the from and to of a link are just the node IDs it's connecting from and to. And we already know one of these. We know we want it to connect to the new node ID, so we can actually just provide that directly. But we want it to come from whatever node we clicked on. And this is, again, where the events details come in useful, because we have the args.click node, so we know what node we clicked on. So we can say from args.click node, but not the object, we want the ID. And really, that's pretty much all there is to it. I'm actually going to get rid of the console.log because I don't think we need it anymore. And if I run, now, look at that. I can click on node 1, and I'm getting a bunch of new nodes connected to it. I can click on these, and look at that. All the new nodes are connected to whatever I am clicking on. So I can actually create my own crazy custom layout like this. Look at that. And I can even rearrange it at the end, so you can get an idea of how ZoomCharts would lay out a bunch of data if you happen to have this particular data set and we're using the default layout settings. And that's a basic example of how you can use events to extend some of the behaviors of ZoomCharts. Obviously, this is a relatively basic example, and I don't want to dwell too much on this, since this is, well, just an example, and it's not really the core item of the video, but I did want to give you a taste of how some of these ideas would work in something a little bit closer to a realistic use case rather than just, oh, this is the feature that does this, and this is the feature that does that. So that's the main thing here. And if there's anything you take away from this, I think it should be the big three aspects of ZoomCharts events. The first thing is the handler itself, because this is how anything happens at all with events. The second thing is the args, because this is what contains most of the information you'll want about the event. And that usually pertains to how you make it do whatever you're interested in your use case. And the third is the ZoomCharts API, because that's usually a big element of how you make ZoomCharts respond to your events in whatever way your use case demands. And with that, that concludes the basic example of how events work. So now we're going to shift to the second thing we said we're going to discuss, which is where we branch out a little bit, discuss some of the other sorts of events and some other cases, and just give a brief overview of how some of those details work out. So I think the main thing to keep in mind as we go through this is what we've discussed so far with this OnClick event. This really covers the core idea that's common to all of us. The core thing of how you're going to be implementing events, no matter what you're doing, looks a lot like this. Maybe not the specific case of adding data to charts, that'll of course depend on your use case, but the general scheme of event handlers, using args, using chart API, those are really the core features in all the event types. And here we're just talking about how some of the details might shift just a little bit depending on what sort of event you're implementing. The biggest detail that might be different in various other use cases is event type, because clicking, while very common, very important, it's not the only thing you might want to respond to. And just like HTML, there are a lot of different event types that ZoomCharts supports. I'm not going to cover all of them. They're all listed in the documentation if you want to look at them. But there's a lot of them. Some of them are chart specific, some of them cover like very particular cases, but there's a few of them that I would say are more common, more critical to be aware of than others, and I've listed those out below. So these are event types that apply on all the different chart types, so no matter what chart you're using, these events are supported. And I'd say, again, they're just much, much more common. There's two broad classes of them, one of which is click events, and I'll talk about those first because they're a straightforward extension of what we've already discussed. So aside from just on single click, you also have the different event types like double click, right click, triple click, and these work just like you expect. They're just like OnClick, but they're responding to different click events. So you could maybe right click and have a menu that explores some other details of your data. You can maybe right click and even have another chart come up, and that gives you more insight into whatever the user's right clicking on. You could have double click, and maybe in a case like this, rather than double clicking, rather than single clicking, just adding a node, maybe double click removes a node or collapses nodes or whatever. So this adds a much richer field of different user interaction. And the big thing with triple click is just that ZoomCharts itself doesn't have any features bound to triple click by default. So you don't have to worry about, oh, what is ZoomCharts going to do if you add a triple click event handler? So that's the main reason that is interesting and useful to be aware of. By the way, if you are using one of the main click events, and let's say the default behavior in that click is getting in the way of whatever you need to do. You need that not to happen. Maybe always, maybe only in certain conditions, what have you. The main way you would stop that is using the event argument, so E, and prevent default. Now, in the case of NetChart, there is no default behavior, really. When you click on links and stuff, that's not really a click action, that's the selection behavior, and you would configure that with the selection settings if you wanted to disable that. But let's say something like on right click, that's a better example. So let's do on right click, E args, and let's say we need this right click menu that usually comes up to just not occur. So I can just say prevent default, and now if I run and right click, you notice now we don't get that menu anymore because we're preventing the default event. And now I'm free to customize right click to do whatever I need in my use case. And those are really the biggest ideas with the click events. So now I want to talk about the other major class of events, which is update events. So unlike click events, where the user is going to the chart and asking the chart to do something, in update events, something has already happened with the chart for whatever reason. Maybe it's a user, maybe it's a script, maybe it's whatever, but something has happened in the chart, and maybe you want to respond to that in some way or another. And the different things that can change in the chart, these are semi-self-explanatory in the names. Some of them are more obvious than others, but I'll just give a brief overview of what these mean. So on settings change, this is, I think, mostly self-explanatory. If you say call chart.update settings and change the settings, then this will fire an on settings change event. So, hey, the settings have changed. Maybe the chart needs to change something else in response to that. Yeah, selection change, I think, also relatively self-explanatory. If the user selects something different or the selection API is invoked, hey, the selection has changed. What do you want to do in response to that? And on hover change, also mostly self-explanatory. If the user is moving their mouse cursor over things and something they're hovering is changed, this is more of a chart update event than a user interaction event. I mean, you can classify it either way. These are sort of arbitrary classifications, but yeah, so when that changes, do you want something new to happen? Maybe, oh, the user is hovering over node 2, and this represents something very interesting, and I want to give the user, say, a tooltip, giving them a bunch of extra information about what's going on in node 2. That's something you'd use onHover change for. The two that are a little bit less obvious are the onPosition change and onChart update. So onPosition change, this is something that happens every time ZoomCharts renders a frame of animation. So if I have something that needs to stay synchronized with the chart, that's where I would use this, for example. So maybe I have another chart that I want to keep perfectly in sync, frame by frame, with this chart. That would be a good use case for onPosition change. By the way, after I give this overview of all these events, I will be showing you an example of them in action, so stay tuned for that if this seems a little bit abstract just from the description. But with that, the last thing I want to talk about is onChart update. And this, I think, is maybe the most opaque because, I mean, okay, what's an update? Like, what counts as a chart having updated? So pretty much, anytime the state of the chart that is being displayed to the user changes, one chart update event will fire. So when the chart loads, that's chart update event. If I click and this causes a ton of different animation, that's one chart update event, not a bunch of them. And so forth and so on. So if, like, our API calls and then that fires an update event, you get the idea. So that's the general idea here. Just this tells you something has changed with the chart and you might need to respond to that. Now, to make some of these ideas a little bit more concrete, I'm going to give a high-level tour of an example where some of these different event types are all used together to do something a little bit more complicated and a little bit more interesting. And it's just going to be the high-level tour at this point. If you're interested in how to build something more complicated, like step-by-step how that would work, we're going to discuss a little bit more of that in the cross-chart filtering video, so stay tuned for that. But here I just want to give you the idea of what do these ideas look like in practice, so you have some notion of how that might apply to whatever you're trying to do. And the example I've chosen here is this case where you have this time chart and you have this overview selection. So I can change the selection and you see it's like a high-level overview of the entire chart, and I can zoom in and these two things stay completely synchronized. So this is a nice little feature. I can explore the data and also have this high-level view of where I am within the data and easily scan around to wherever I want. So that's the example, and obviously this is a little bit more advanced compared to what ZoomCharts offers out of the box, but at the end of the day, this is a relatively straightforward application of events. There's a couple tricks and a couple nuances, but I'll show you how all that works. So the first ingredient in this example is the chart itself, or in this case, charts, because we have the main chart and the overview chart. And this is very similar to what we've seen so far in all the different examples of charts. And the main difference is there's just a few things done a little bit differently. For example, we're using a theme here with some common settings. And we haven't talked about this, but this is something you can do. If you have multiple charts and you have some settings that will be the same between both of them, you can create what we call a theme, where we put all those settings in a single object, set the theme to those settings, and that'll just apply all those settings. So that's a very nice way you can reuse settings between different charts. But other than that, it's really pretty much what we've seen so far. I mean, we are using some interaction settings, but other than that, it's just we use the data, just like we discussed in the data video, we have series like we discussed there, and we have events like we discussed in this video. So other than that, this is pretty much what we've all seen, so nothing too new here. The main thing as far as how it works, though, is we're using the onPosition change and the onChart update event. So what we're saying is anytime there's a frame of animation or something changes in the chart, then we want to update the overview chart in order to match that. And we'll discuss how that works, but at the high level, this is how this works. We have a relatively standard chart creation, and we want to update the overview chart anytime anything at all happens in the main chart. The other part, of course, is the overview chart. We call it select in the variable, but yeah, this is the overview chart. And this is again very similar. We have the theme that has the main settings, and the rest of this is pretty much just settings to make sure that when we interact with this chart, it just stays a selection and stays this really tiny chart with no overview features. So that's really what all this is, and I'm not going to discuss that in too much detail, but this just illustrates there's a lot of different settings in ZoomCharts, and they can do a lot of very specific things. So that's something to be aware of when you're setting up your examples. You probably won't need, of course, to memorize all this or know all the different settings because there's a ton of them, but just be aware there are a lot of possibilities, and you probably will be able to find settings that do what you want, even if you have some very odd, very quirky needs in your specific use case. Aside from the settings that all configure it to be very tiny, we have the events, which are again mostly the sort of things we've talked about so far. OnClick, we're just providing default like we discussed earlier in the video, and this is why when we click on the selection, well, nothing happens or doesn't clear, we can't drill down. In fact, there's even a comma that explains all this, so that's nice. If you want to pause the lesson and read some of the comments, you can do that, because they definitely talk about some of the nuances of how this works that are maybe not necessarily critical, but definitely useful in making sense of what's going on here. But otherwise, the main thing is just when we change the selection, we want to make sure the main chart changes in order to, well, just stay synchronized with that. And just to zoom out for a moment, when you put these two event handlers together, that gives you a really nice picture of what's going on. So we have the overview chart, which synchronizes the main chart anytime the selection changes, and up here we have the main chart, which anytime anything at all happens here, synchronizes the overview chart with this update overview chart event. And that's really the big picture view of what's going on here. We have event handlers in both charts that will synchronize the other when something interesting happens. And that's really the gist of what's going on in this example. And the other half of this, of course, is the event handler itself. When we're dealing with these update type events, what does the event handler look like? How do we write an event handler that synchronizes the two charts? So if we scroll down and look at the update overview chart event handler, I think you'll notice that to a large extent this is basically familiar. Because what are we doing here? Well, we're creating the event handler with the event and the args. We're getting data we need from the args. So when we are moving around in the main event, we're looking at what's the time start, that is, what time is the beginning of the chart at, and what time is the end of the chart at. So we see, again, a common theme here of using the args to get the information we need for the event. And what do we do with that? We are, again, using a common thing of using the chart API to cause what we want to happen. So in this case, we're using select, which if you remember is what we called the overview chart, that's the variable name. And we're using the selection API to set the selection to, well, what the time start and time end is. And that's really all there is to the synchronization. Every time we are, well, anything at all is updating in the main chart, we're setting the selection in the overview chart to whatever the start and end range of the main chart is. And there is a little bit of nuance here because we have this limit selection here, and that is basically making sure this time start and time end stays within the data range. So it's sort of like a clamp function. But other than that, that's really all there is. And I hope this drives home the 3 steps we talked about earlier in our example of the event handler, the args, and the API. Those are really the core of how these things work, even when you're doing things that might look a little bit more fancy on the surface, like these synchronized charts, even when you're dealing with update events too, which you might think of as a different type, but same general idea applies. So what about this overview chart? What about the update main chart event that it's calling whenever we change the selection? And if you look at this, Yeah, the code is a little bit more complicated here because there's a few other details to handle, but I think you'll find that the big picture, basically the same thing. We have the event handler. And what we're doing is we're looking at args to get information we want. In this case, the selection start and end range. And then once we have that, and again, we're doing the clamp, which is a little bit more of a nuance, but again, same picture applies. We take the selection start and end that we get from the args, and we're using the chart API to update it. So in this case, we're using chart, which, if you remember, is what we call the main chart variable. And we're using the time API, which sets the time range that it's displaying to whatever range the selection is. And that's really the core idea of what's going on here. There's a few nuances, like again, the limit selection. We are only wanting this to happen when this is being done by, well, not the API, so that we aren't having redundant events. We are wanting to change the selection in the select overview if the range has been clamped so that, well, just the selection always stays within range. But otherwise, just general, same high-level 3-step picture. And that's really all there is to this. So, there is the limit selection event. This is what this looks like, just in case you were wondering how you would clamp time ranges. But otherwise, that's really all there is to it. And you see, this is a really nice example of how different events can all work together to make a nice effect that isn't possible with all of them individually, but same idea applies even in more complicated cases. That's really the big thing I want to drive home here. And with that, we've really covered the big ideas with events. Obviously, there are nuances and more details we could go into, and all these other chart-specific events, and all these other things, but these are the big ideas. So let's just try to summarize the video at this point. What have we discussed? What have we covered? The first thing is events themselves. So going back to our netchart example, events are a lot like HTML events, by analogy that is, where you set up the chart exactly the way you want it with all your style settings and all your data, just like you might set up the HTML page with all the different specific layouts and all the CSS you want. But then you need the bridge. Then you need, okay, how do I take this thing I've created and make it respond to whatever the user is doing or whatever else is going on in the ways that I need for my use case? And that's where events come in. Just like in HTML, you would add in your event handler, and that would let you make whatever JavaScript you need respond to the event. Same idea applies in ZoomCharts. Once you've set up the chart how you like, you can add event handlers that set up ZoomCharts to respond however you like to whatever goes on in ZoomCharts. So that's the first big idea. That's where event handlers apply. The next is, what does an event handler look like? And I think I've maybe beaten a dead horse at this point, but the thing is, there's really 3 things to it. There's the event handler itself, there's the args, which for the most part contain all the details you would need to respond to the event appropriately, and then there's the API, which helps you cause the chart to do different things based on the event. And those are the 3 key ingredients in not necessarily all event handlers, but those are definitely the big ingredients that make event handlers work. And other than that, we discussed how there's different event types. So we have like the different click events, and there's all the update events. So those are the main categories of events. And the basic process of implementing these event handlers works the same. You're still dealing with the event handler, you're still dealing with the arg, you're still dealing with the API. The main difference is just, what are you responding to? And hopefully, throughout this video, you've gotten a sense of both what click works, and through this other example, how some of the update events work. So you see how when, for example, selection changes, same thing happens, that is, the same basic event handler structure works, but now we're just responding to selection events. And over in the main chart here, we have these, I'm looking at the wrong thing, and over in the main chart, we have these on position changes, which happens on every animation frame, and on chart update, which happens, say, when we clicked on something, there's a single update event, or when the chart loads, there's a single update event. But again, same broad concepts apply to all different event handlers. You're just responding to a different event, but you're still doing the same basic process. And those, I think, are really the big takeaways from this video. And with that, that just about wraps up the video. So if everything we've discussed so far makes sense to you, at least at the high level, then you pretty much get event handlers in ZoomCharts. In the next video, we're going to be discussing cross-chart filtering. And this is a really nice example of a relatively common use case that's also a little bit more complicated and a little bit more nuanced. So it's a very good case to apply a lot of the different ideas we've learned in a more complicated use case and see how things get a little bit more nuanced, how things shake out when you start adding extra layers of complexity, and plus, you get to see how something that has a decent chance of applying to what you're doing works just directly. Like, here's how this works. So that's what we'll be discussing in the next lesson. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you then.